Two dead man talking. Tonight's show is from the incredible mind of Silver-Syndicate over on Reddit, No Sleep. And as ever, please do let us know what you thought down below in the comments box. Please do like and share. Well, it really does help build the channel and our community further. And why not hashtag TeamFEAR and DMT's Cryptid crew. And so, with that aside, let's get into tonight's story. Entitled, The Devil's Guard Dog. Let's get straight into that. My eyes fluttered open as my body strained from an almost unbearable wave of encumberment. Although I was waking up, my body fought against me to slip back down into a state of unconsciousness. However, I did my best to resist it. Everything feeling heavy as I struggled to move and sit up. A sharp ping rang out into my head and down into my neck as I held my temples, cringing as I quickly realized that my forehead was damp. I removed my hand and looked down at my fingers, seeing them coated in both fresh and dried blood, and felt warm to the touch. Running a hand through my hair, I slowly came to the conclusion that I'd been hit in the head at some point, as my hair was strewn with scabs of blood that flaked down onto the hard ground below me. What happened? I asked myself faintly, slowly coming back to reality as I looked around my surroundings, my one eye hazy and nearly blind from the now impending migraine. I know that in movies you see normally, they show captives panicking when they wake up in a strange place. However, for me, it wasn't fear, but a deep confusion that I felt as my mind worked hard on figuring out where I was. The walls were a mix of brick and stone. A single sink sat adjacent to me, along with a small table. However, the room was only comprised of 3 solid walls. The 4th wall was completely open, but also completely barred off by posts of thick steel that stretched high to the ceiling. Everything looked old and worn, yet surprisingly clean. Even from laying on the hard stone floor, there wasn't a speck of dirt on me. The place was large as well, maybe the size of 2 middle-class living rooms, attached end to end, and faint firelight from a torch outside the bars provided just enough illumination for me to be able to see shadows dancing along the far wall. I held my head in my hands again, thinking over everything, trying to put the pieces together. However, nothing about this made any sense. I had to have been taken by someone, removed from my day-to-day life and kidnapped. I was fairly certain of that. However, I couldn't for the life of me figure out how. One moment I was on my way to work early in the morning, and the next I'm waking up here feeling like I've been hit by a truck at least twice. After a while of waiting, I could hear the soft patter of footsteps approaching from somewhere, and I raised my head to call out to whomever was coming, but quickly recoiled as the sound of shrieking metal pierced my ears and made my head ring. Dragging sounds and more clinking of metal followed, but much softer this time as I withdrew my hands from my ears.
Looks like he's starting to wake up. Good. He'll make a good meal for this one.
I heard a deep voice speak. However, his words didn't exactly give me any comfort, and only fed the confusion of much more as to what in the hell was happening. I looked over at the source of the noise and the voice, but both from my migraine and not being fully awake yet, I couldn't make out much more than their outlines in the dim light. There were 4 of them, 2 standing side by side, and 2 dragging someone along the ground by his shoulders, and even with my vision impaired, I could tell that they were dressed in black robes.
Please, who are you people?
I asked, but to no avail. My words falling on deaf ears as they dropped the man to the ground and immediately began walking out, not wasting any time and not giving me a second glance. And the shrieking came again, and this time I recognized it as the sound of a large metal door being closed, or so I assumed, and before long their footsteps disappeared somewhere deeper in this place. I braced myself on the wall and attempted to stand, managing to somehow get to my feet and look over at the poor man who had just been dropped in here like a sack of potatoes. He was dressed in grey rags, his matted red hair laying out over the floor at his sides as he lay on his stomach, He looked thin and frail, and almost dead as he didn't move. And I slowly began to walk to the other side of the room where he was, and see if there was anything I could do for him. I may not have been able to do much, but given we were the only ones in here, it was worth a try. I got down on my knees once I was close enough and used what little strength I had to roll him over onto his back. Dark circles ran under his closed eyes, his skin clammy to the touch. He had a surprisingly gentile face, even if it was lupine and sunken in, looking like he may have been in his late 20s, if even that. I breathed a sigh of relief when I could see his chest gently rising and falling as he breathed. However, he was pale and cold, his body more taken on the appearance of an old man than that of someone his age. And that's not counting for how bruised and beaten he looked. "Fuck, just stay with me, okay? Hang in there," I said as I took off my jacket and lifted him into my lap. He didn't even so much as flinch from the motion as I wrapped my jacket around him, laying like a rag doll in my arms. I didn't know what to do. I tried to remain calm, but this was all happening so quickly that I was at a loss. I looked around again and my eyes fell on the sink. "Come on, let's try to get you cleaned up a little bit, okay, man?" I said, knowing he probably couldn't hear me, but I think I was more talking to keep myself calm and focused than to comfort the man in my arms. I put one of his arms around my shoulder, and this time he did flinch a bit. I muttered a quick, "Sorry," as I lifted him, knowing he was more than likely painful as I stood up and began walking him over to the other side of the room. He tried his best to walk with me as I supported his weight, groaning softly now and again as I struggled to hold us both up. I set him down against the wall and quickly, or as quickly as I could manage, went to take off my shirt and wet it down. Nothing about any of this was good. Whoever these people were, whatever they wanted, I knew it wasn't going to end well. I'd seen enough movies to know that people like this don't exactly take someone with the intent of letting them go. And so I'd have to at least try and get out of here once I was a little stronger. As for the man now currently laying against the sink and with his back slumped against the wall, I was at a loss for him as well. He was weak, probably had broken bones from how dark the bruises on his skin were, and going up against 4 other people would be impossible with him being as thin as he was. Hell, it'd be impossible for me. That situation was completely hopeless as it stood. However, for now, I wanted to help him. He was the only comfort I had in there, and at this point, he was probably in the same situation I was, not knowing where he was or what happened to him. On the other hand, maybe he did know something. Maybe he could help me understand what was going on, and we could get out of here. However, I never got the chance to ask about any of that. To my surprise, there was running water, cool water splashing my hands and over my balled-up shirt before I suddenly was ripped away from it. The sudden motion sent me flying to the ground, like something had grabbed the back of my neck and pulled me with a force I'd never felt before, and sliding for a brief moment against the ground before I came to an abrupt stop, the skin of my bare back stinging and the air in my lungs being forced out from the sudden impact. It took me a second to register what had just happened, and as I looked up, that fear finally set in like a hurricane crashing against a ship's hull, my blood running cold, as though ice water had been pumped into my veins. Standing above me was the man, having jumped up like a shot and now looming over me like a predator. His rags hung from his thin body as sharp claws tipped his spindly fingers. Snarled teeth turned to black, dagger-like points like the maw of a shark. And ghost-white eyes bordered by black ends peered straight into my soul, split like the eyes of a cat and burning with animalistic nature. He let out a growl that practically vibrated in my chest and went to lunge. However, flight kicked in through the shock and I scrambled to my side, narrowly avoiding his thing's claws as they scraped against the floor, kicking up chunks of stone and spraying sparks as they did so. I quickly got to my feet and rushed to the bars, beginning to scream for help, but it was clear that wasn't going to do any good. Within seconds, the man was on me again, this time grabbing the back of my hair and forcing my head into the bars as he sunk his teeth into my shoulder. I screamed and thrashed, feeling those dark blade-like teeth rip through my flesh as I made one final kick, thrusting backwards. Feeling my heel connect with something hard and a sickening cracking echoing throughout the room. This time it was the man's turn to scream, and he instantly let go. His knee caving in as he collapsed to the ground. I pushed myself off the bars and ran to the other side of the room, knowing that I needed to think quickly and only had seconds. I could hear him getting up behind me, letting out a primal cry of anger and pain as he went to rush in again. The broken knee doing very little to stop his bloodlust. In a split-second decision, I grabbed the only thing in the room I could possibly use for a weapon, bending down and clasping my hands tightly around the leg of a table, and in one motion I swung it over my shoulder just as the creature got about a foot from me. The table leg came down diagonally and practically exploded in a loud crash of splinters against the side of his head, sending him to the ground hard. I breathed heavily, the table leg still clasped in my hands as the rest of it lay in parts and pieces around the man. He staggered and couldn't manage to get himself back up, a stream of blood flowing from a large gash in his head, and dripping onto the cold ground as he wheezed and growled. He went to look up at me, but I wasn't taking a chance. Wielding the table leg like a bat, I swung down with everything I had and bashed him in the back of the head, watching his skull bounce off the ground before he fell completely still, blood pooling beneath him. The table leg dropped from my hands as I looked down at him, clattering against the ground at his side as I slowly backed up. My heart was beating like a jackhammer, and I slid down the wall at the opposite end of the room, wanting to put as much distance between me and him as possible. And all was quiet again as I brought my knees to my chest, wrapping my arms around my legs and trying to stop myself from shaking. All that could be heard were my panicked sobs as I rested my head onto my knees, my shoulders throbbing as blood dripped down over my chest. My head was spinning and I felt sick, all the blood and panic playing into the migraine as my vision began to fade in and out, my body completely overwhelmed along with my mind, and I sat there in silence, my back against the cold wall as I began to give in to the exhaustion. Not knowing what to do or how much more I could take, I fell into a deep sleep, praying that I'd be back home in my bed by the time I woke up. The Devil's Guard Dog. Part 2. Let's get straight into that. I have no idea how long I slept. It could have been an hour, could have been a day. However, I quickly realized how much I took the light for granted when I couldn't tell how long I'd been out. It's strange how your perception of time gets so skewed and turned around when you have no way of telling it, missing the ticking of clocks or the sounds of songbirds in the morning. For me, I'd grown accustomed to waking up to the drilling sounds of my alarm clock, a signal that it was once again time to get up and head into work in the small morning hours. Now, opening my eyes without that sound in my ears, it felt like I'd been taken out of time completely. That routine occurrence and signature of normality taken from me, breaking the pattern and filling me with a strange anxiety that only grew the more I woke up. There was a sharp pulling in my neck from sleeping while sitting up, and the pain in my shoulder quickly reminded me where I was. I lifted my head from my knees and leaned back against the wall, wincing from the cold and the pain as I felt over my shoulder. What was once just a small bit of blood isolated to my head was now a plethora of dried scabs that dripped down over my shoulder and chest. And as I felt around, I could feel at least 10 very distinct holes in my shoulder from the bite I'd received. It was painful, and I was still in a bit of shock. However, I found it a bit easier to focus now that the migraine had dulled and I was able to see clearly. Looking over to the far side of the room, the man still lay there, still on the ground with parts and pieces of the table strewn around his limp body. And I swallowed hard, a lump forming in my throat as I thought over what had happened. And although I may have been somewhat relieved that this monster wasn't attacking me anymore, the very real dread from the realization that I could have very well committed murder put a sour taste in my mouth. And a part of me wanted to get up and see if he was alive, and part of me never wanted to see him get up again. A conflict of emotional distress as I watched him with a wary eye. My eyes had become accustomed to the dim lighting, and as I looked closely, my stomach dropped. Even from this distance, I could see that he was breathing. I didn't have a lot of time to think this over before he began to slowly move. First his fingers, then his arms, and before long he lifted himself onto his elbows, seeming to shake his head as he was waking up, same as I had. The table leg I'd used as a makeshift weapon was still laying by his side, and I cursed myself for not taking it with me, as I knew there was no possible way I could pull off another lucky escape from this thing's assault again. He looked around a little, seemingly in a daze, before his gaze quickly shifted to me. I caught a glimpse of his beady eyes reflecting the light before I quickly closed my own, staying completely still. It may not have been the best idea to pretend that I was asleep, but what else was I supposed to do? I couldn't fight back and I couldn't run, and so for the time I prayed he wouldn't attack, if I just kept myself still. More treating this like an encounter with a wild animal and fighting not to make any sudden motion, even if my brain was screaming at me to run. I could hear him get up, and clearly the blow to his leg doing quite a bit of damage, as I could tell he was walking with an uneven gait. However, that didn't stop my heart from racing, as I could tell he was moving closer to me, and I continued to listen. My mouth growing dry as every step closer put my nerves on the fritz, and before long he walked up and stopped right in front of me. His silence followed. Dread filled my mind as I waited for him to lunge and finish what he had started. However, I was waiting for a blow that surprisingly never came. Instead, I could hear him sigh under his breath and take a few shaky steps to move beside me before I heard the rush of water. He moved to the sink, soft splashing sounds coming as I slightly opened my eyes to see exactly what he was doing. To my shock, he seemed to be cleaning the blood off his head. He wasn't growling and he wasn't trying to rip my shoulder off. No, he was acting shockingly calm and simply moving his hair and washing off the dried blood. From my angle I could see a lot. However, I could see one detail that made me a little bit curious. He wasn't just washing the wounds, or he was licking his fingers and then running them over the gash in the side of his head. I was amazed as I watched the flesh beginning to almost weave itself back together, healing more and more as he did it, and before long there wasn't anything there at all, not even a scar to show where he'd been hit. My fear was replaced by a sense of awe from what I was witnessing. However, that feeling was quickly snuffed out when he turned to me again, those white eyes catching mine. I quickly closed my eyes once more, hoping he didn't see me watching him, and to my relief, he didn't seem to notice as he began slowly shambling back to the other side of the room. I breathed deeply as my nerves seemed to settle when he moved away. However, I opened my eyes once again when I heard a thudding sound, and quickly I looked over. He'd practically collapsed in one of the darker corners of our large cell, holding his leg and panting slightly. I guessed I'd done more damage than I thought, and despite what I'd seen him do, it seemed that he couldn't manage to fix his leg the same way. I took a risk and moved to get a little bit more comfortable as I watched, but the moment I made any sort of noise, he looked back over at me, and this time, I definitely couldn't fake being asleep to avoid his gaze. "So, you are awake. Thought you were," he said, his voice surprisingly having a soft and deep tone. However, I couldn't ignore the growl that carried at the end of his words. And I was at a loss for words, glancing around as though I thought he'd spoken to someone else. However, I knew that that was impossible. He just shook his head when I didn't respond, turning his gaze to the ceiling as he rested his head back.
Did anyone ever teach you that staring is impolite?
He spoke again. This time, I stumbled over my words, not exactly sure if I should apologize or not, as I turned away from him. When I did, he seemed to chuckle, a sound that sent every hair on the back of my neck on point.
What's wrong? Cat got your tongue. You seemed to be rather keen on helping me the other night.
You attacked me. Fuck you. I spoke before my mind could catch up with me, immediately regretting what I had said. However, it only seemed to make this creature chuckle more.
You're alive, aren't you? You got in a lucky shot. You should be happy you were able to get me off before I went further. Your kind does taste rather addicting, after all. So sweet to the palate, warm to the touch.
My stomach turned from his words, feeling sickened by how he talked about me like I was a meal. Shut up, I snapped, starting to get my voice back to some extent, trying not to cross any lines, but feeling bitter and angry about what happened and what was happening. He went quiet after that and still watching the ceiling as he clicked his claws against the stone floor, the sound feeding my imagination with images of large bugs skittering across stone. There was a long pause of awkward silence. I started to calm down a little, knowing he wasn't going to try and kill me, or at least not yet. And cautiously, I stood up, nervously crossing my arms over my stomach and leaning against the wall, looking down at him over in the corner. Well, it took me a minute, but I eventually spoke up again. What are you?
Does it matter?
He asked, this time seemingly less amused than he was before, as he looked up at me.
You are a human, and I am not. There's really not a lot you'll gain from learning more about me. And besides...
He glanced around the room, looking at the bars and stone walls.
It seems to me you've got bigger problems if you found yourself in here, of all places.
I couldn't exactly argue with that. I still couldn't remember how I got here or why, and even if he was a threat. But that didn't change the fact that I was very much trapped like he was, and that was more of a problem, even without him in the mix. I took a deep breath and released a shaky sigh, nodding in agreement. Do you have a name?
Decius. And you?
Fletcher, I simply said. Not exactly thrilled to be acquainted with this creature, but it's not like I had much of a choice. That and the slow and uncomfortable conversation was definitely better than him coming for my throat. I wanted to ask more, but my attention was quickly turned to the outside of the cell, as a large metal door swung open. I'd been so distracted by everything that I hadn't even realized someone had walked down to where the door was. It opened from a cutout in the stone, a completely solid metal door that had a large lock and bolt on the inside of it. After what I saw from Decius last night, I could understand why. A hooded figure in black robes walked in, setting down what looked like a covered tray before quickly turning to walk out. Wait! Don't go yet, I need to talk with you. I yelled as I ran over to the door, only to have it slammed in my face, the sound of the heavy bolt sliding into place and coming from the other side. Hey, come back! You can't fucking do this to people! You have to let me go! I yelled, pounding against the large heavy door.
Don't bother. These people don't exactly talk much when they're not babbling about their religious crap, especially to someone who they use for their little games. Trust me, I would know.
Decius said as he leaned forward a little, looking down at the platter on the floor and narrowing his eyes.
Seems they decided to keep you alive for a little longer, at least. Must have caught their interest. Either that or you're being used. You truly are in a deep well of luck, my friend. Well, either that or they're being nice and keeping the food fresh.
What is wrong with you? Would you knock it off with the creepy cannibal talk already?
Oh, what? Are you going to kick me again? Break my ribs and cave in my skull? Maybe paint the walls with my blood as I gag on my own intestines?
Shut up! I screamed, looking over at him and feeling my temperature go up, fighting not to tackle the bastard. He watched me and turned his head, almost looking confused as he did, once over on me.
A little testy for a murderer, aren't you? What? Big bad killer gets so butthurt when a more powerful one starts talking about the art of death? Or are you one of those pissants who doesn't like the sight of blood after they've done the deed?
The fuck are you on about? I haven't killed anyone. Hell, I haven't even started a fight in my life. He once again turned his head, like a dog not understanding what I was saying to him. This shift in tone was strange, and I couldn't help but feel like he was being genuine. And so this time, I asked a different question. Who do you think I am? I asked in a far gentler tone than before, and once more feeling nervous as his expression seemed to reflect a very similar emotion.
No, that's not right. I have been in this exact room more times than I can count, seen many cross my path, and yet none, and I repeat, none, haven't tasted blood, at least to some extent in their lifetime.
Well, he sat up a little straighter, blinking a few times as he thought over his words.
So, you're saying you're innocent?
I was never guilty. I live in a small flat in California. I'm going to college. I work at a shitty little fast food joint at the end of town. And my 60-year-old mom calls me every weekend to ask when I'm going to graduate. My life isn't exactly special, I said, watching him closely. Well, he curled up closer to the wall, letting out a sigh of stress as he turned away from me, rubbing his broken knee that didn't exactly seem to be sitting on the right angle. And knowing that I probably wasn't going to get any more out of him, I walked over to the tray and picked it up, lifting a lid to see what was inside. It was a simple meal, something I'd imagine being served in prison. A sectioned off tray with beans, potatoes, some kind of meat that I couldn't recognize, and a small plastic fork sitting on the side. Reluctantly, I went back to my original spot and sat down, taking small bites at the food. It wasn't that I wasn't hungry, and truthfully, I was starving, but my stomach didn't seem to be settling down anytime soon.
Dusklings,
I heard Decius speak softly, raising my head from the food to look over at him. What did you say?
Dusklings. You asked. They call us Dusklings.
Just as he finished, I could hear the heavy footsteps approaching. I saw him perk his head up and look over at the door.
Here they come again, he said with a disapproving tone, and before I could even respond, the metal door flung open with a heavy thud as it slammed against the stone.
4 hooded figures walked in and over to me, not even skipping a beat as they grabbed my arms and lifted me from the ground. I shrieked as my wound on my shoulder pulled, struggling against their grasp. "Hey, don't put your hands on me!" I screamed, a futile attempt to get their attention as they began dragging me away and out of the open door, all the while not saying a word. I looked back at Decius, being met with a grim expression as he curled up on the floor, my sight of him being broken as the door shut. I looked around the dark tunnel, the smell of wet dirt hitting my nose as I struggled to keep up with them. I couldn't see where we were going, but these people walked with purpose, like they didn't even need to see as they made their way through this place effortlessly. A torch came into view up ahead, looking ominous in the distance, and bringing with it the sounds of more movement, along with the sharp clanking of metal. "Where are you taking me?" I asked. However, they still didn't respond, and only continued forward as a sense of dread began to grow in the pit of my stomach. was terrified. Before long, the maze of dark tunnels gave way to a large room. The vaulted ceiling stretched up so far that I couldn't even make out the top of it. The walls lined with torches that now burned a ghostly blue, and I immediately noticed the smell of ozone in the air, as if a storm was rolling in, even within a closed-off chamber. In the center of the room was a single cylindrical pillar that jutted out at the center of a set of stairs, and at the top hung several chains that had medieval-looking shackles at the ends of them. I fought back, but I was already drained, the food doing very little to give me any energy as they led me up the stone steps.
You will understand soon enough. This must happen. It is his will.
One of the robed figures spoke. Whose will? It's not making any sense. Let me go, you freaks! I thrashed again. However, as soon as my attempt to get away started, I was quickly put to a stop, as one of them raised their hand and smacked me hard in the back of the head.
You dare not speak back to our leader in that tone. His word is law, and you will be willing to listen, or we will make you,
he said. Cold and dark threaded chains were clasped around my body, and my hands bound as I was secured to the pillar. Easy now, brother. He's young. No need to correct one who doesn't know our ways yet. Another spoke, presumably the leader, however, with identical attire. I honestly couldn't tell them apart. It is an honor to take part in our teachings for those who are willing to listen and willing to understand. And those who understand are willing to see the light. He began, talking like a preacher giving a sermon. The light guides and teaches us all, and the light shines down on you tonight, my son. Your soul shines brightly to us all, and we are happy to see its light. Illumination from within is a gift, but with every blessing comes sacrifice. My heart jumped at that as I looked up at him, and although I couldn't see his face, I could have sworn he was smiling. All life is only borrowed, dear child. One day we must give it back. But corruption, that is the key to the light. The yin to the yang, as above so below. What is within you is outside of you, and through the most ebony blackness comes the brightest of stars. I felt like I was going to puke up what little food I'd gotten into my stomach, and before I could manage to even so much as scream for help, he said something more, something that made me turn pale. Through corruption of innocence comes the strongest of souls after all. One must only know pain to understand it. One must know the truth of the eclipse and of the dead sun. His sharp pain surged through my side, feeling like I'd just been stabbed by a hot dagger as I screamed, crying out as the feeling of fire began to pump through my veins and traveling up my side and into my chest. I instantly vomited, sobbing as the pain shot through my other side, my body seizing up as I pulled on the chains that bound me. I couldn't tell what they were doing to me, and I didn't want to know, keeping my gaze at the ceiling as they began to chant the same thing over and over again. Corruption of the innocence as we walk through the dark. Corruption of the body brings the gateway to the sun. Death of the mind brings the soul to the door. Opening the door shines the path to the light. My vision began to fade in and out, screaming until my throat was raw and my voice strained. I felt hopeless, wanting for this to end, willing to give anything just for it to stop. However, my inner pleas did nothing as the ravaging of my body continued. My body grew limp in the chains as I began to lose consciousness, only held out by the steel chains that pulled tightly on my wrists as I collapsed to my knees. I was blacking out from the pain, my world fading away from me. However, as I looked up at them, Even under the dark hoods, I could have sworn I saw white, cat-like eyes staring down at me. And behind them lurked thousands more. The Devil's Guard Dog. Part 3. Let's get straight into that. Sometimes life can be absolutely normal. Nothing to worry about, no tragic past to dwell over, no worries over the life you live. And yet, even when you've done nothing wrong, and everything seems to be going on the straight and narrow, life can throw you a curveball that's blindsiding. And out of all places, my mind could have taken me, all the fear-filled nightmares it could have conjured up. It had taken me to the one place I never wanted to be, yet a place you wouldn't picture when compared to the horrors I'd witnessed. It took me home. My life was dull for a lack of better words. I worked at a simple job and lived a very minimalistic life. However, the one thing that always gave that dullness a spark was my girlfriend. It's cliché, I know, but it was the truth. I'd always thought that there could be no way that this girl likes me, that there's no way a girl this beautiful and perfect could possibly take an interest in me, a man whose personality and life held nothing of real significant value or originality. But she did. We've been friends since high school, and I'd be lying if I didn't say she'd carried me through it. To put it simply, I was never the sharpest tool in the shed, and she was someone who strived to be the best in everything she did. A very hard-working and dedicated individual, always 2 steps ahead, while the rest of our class sat 1 step back. I was easily distracted in school, found it boring, and would rather spend my time at home watching movies or playing the latest Xbox game. My mind was always somewhere else in class, and because of that, my grades were only limping me through my senior year, and I was quickly on my way to failing. I don't remember the exact circumstances that led her to helping me, or maybe she just saw me struggling and wanted to lend a hand, but over time we began studying together. Sometimes once a week, sometimes every day of the week, and sometimes our studying sessions would involve a very in-depth look into anatomy, if you catch my meaning. She dragged me through till graduation, and after that we moved in together. If I were to describe her, with her intelligence and responsibility put aside, I would say she was the female equivalent of a bad boy. Yes, she would dress up and do the typical girl things, but her love for taking risks and going into the party scene would quickly become the forefront of her life as time went on. And I was shocked when she said she didn't want to pursue college when I was applying. If anything, I expected her to jump on that quickly from her reputation. However, she didn't. And I'd gotten accepted to her university, and meanwhile she stayed at home to indulge in the party life. And I wish I could have seen what was happening before it got bad. And I couldn't help but feel like I'd failed her when it did. She helped drag me through school when I was struggling, and I didn't even notice when she began to struggle. It wouldn't be until it was too late that I finally noticed what was happening. She'd been going downhill for a long time, and looking back I should have noticed the signs a lot sooner than I had. Staying out late, coming home with migraines and bloodshot eyes, and the loss of appetite, and the growing distance between us in the bedroom. However, it all came to a head one night. I'd come home from my job to find that she wasn't there. It was extremely late, and normally she would be passed out watching Netflix. However, the apartment was empty. I called around, worried about her and wanted to know where she was. But about an hour later, she came stumbling in through the front door. I don't think she expected me to be home, and I don't think the man dragging her in did either, as they both looked at me like a deer in headlights. Her clothing was disheveled, and I could smell the alcohol on them from a mile away. Her once beautifully glossy black hair now a mess of crazed and twisted mats that was haphazardly pulled back in a ponytail atop of her head. The man holding her didn't look much better, a thin and unclean individual with the remnants of white powder dusting the hairs under his nose. I didn't say anything. My heart felt like it had just been ripped out and stepped on, and I didn't even have the words to express the amount of betrayal that I was feeling. I may not have been very bright, but I was able to put the pieces together, and after a while of letting it sink in, I packed my things and I left. I found out later that she'd been admitted to drug rehab. However, I never spoke to her again and never knew what happened to the man. I think I would have run back to her like a starstruck idiot if she'd asked me to. However, I never heard from her again. No text, no call, no attempt to contact me. 3 years of living together and that much more time falling for her, and it was all thrown away in one night. However, through it all I could feel was guilt. A deep pit of depression I'd fallen into that led to a life of meaningless melancholy. I saw her as the demon who stole my heart, and I was the one who made it that way. My mind was replaying this in my head, seeing him standing before me in that apartment, and that feeling of loss and heartbreaking plaguing my mind. However, that reality was quickly shattered by a rough voice.
"Hey, human, you're not dying on me yet, so wake the fuck up already."
I heard him call, my dream fading as slowly I opened my eyes. And the first thing that greeted me was Odysseus' eyes looking back at me, the same white lights that filled me with so much fear before. This time, however, being this close to him and able to get a better look, I was once again filled with that sense of awe as I noticed a detail I hadn't seen before. There were stars in his eyes, like looking into the vast depths of a nebula.
"Finally, what is this? The third time you've been knocked out?"
"Your bedside manners. I need some work," I grumbled as I slowly sat up with his help. As I remembered what happened, I quickly felt over my side, expecting to see more blood and large gashes. However, my hands only touched over smooth skin, not so much a scratch beneath my fingertips. I was a little in disbelief. I was sure that the hooded cultist had done something to me. But then I remembered how Odysseus had managed to heal himself. I looked back to him. That same sickening feeling crept into the pit of my stomach as I thought over how he could have possibly healed me. "Please tell me you didn't lick."
"Not a fucking word," he growled. "I helped you. Leave it at that."
I quickly nodded and dropped the subject. Odysseus got up and walked over to the sink and grabbing my shirt and tossing it to me.
"Cover yourself. You look like an idiot,"
he said bluntly as the shirt fell in my lap. I sighed and slipped it over my head, leaning against the wall as he moved to sit a little ways from me in the room.
"Who's Aurora?"
"What?"
"You were talking in your sleep. Was she a friend? Girlfriend?"
he asked, a vague interest in his voice. I thought over his question, looking over at him and narrowing my eyes. "Why should I tell you anything?"
"Well, it's either that or we both sit here in complete and utterly dull silence for God knows how long. I don't know if you've looked around lately, but there's not exactly anything exciting going on around here. But it's your choice."
"Well, how about this?" I began as I sat forward. "You tell me about yourself and what's really going on here, and I'll tell you about Aurora."
"I told you, learning about me isn't going to do you any good."
"What's learning about me going to do for you? The hell do you have to gain?" I asked in a more stern tone, watching him roll his eyes and turn away. "Look, if you want me to talk, then you need to do the same. Like you said, we're both kind of stuck together, so might as well."
"You wouldn't believe me if I even told you."
"After the shit I just went through, you really think I'm going to question what you say?"
"I'm telling you, kid, you're human. It's going to sound crazy."
"Fucking try me." This time he went quiet, a clear debate going on in his head as his reluctant nature seemed to be caving, and I wasn't going to let up until it did. "Tell me about the dusklings." Why, he let out a growl under his breath that trailed into a heavy sigh, and after a while he sat forward, folding his legs and facing me.
Okay, fine. What do you know about heaven and hell?"
Well, his question made me sit back a little, striking me as a bit odd given the context. "Well, religion says that hell is where bad people go to be punished after they die. And heaven is where good people go to be rewarded after they die.
Bit of a crude explanation, but yes, those are the basics of it.
Well, he ran a hand through his hair, seeming to strain a little as he thought over his words.
I can tell you that both exist, but not in the way you would think, or not in the way your religions have told it. There is no light, there is no darkness, but a contrast between the two. In simpler words, they can't be one without the other, and everyone has both. There are places between what you believe is life and death, places that are an area where there is complete balance. And then there are places where there's nothing but contrast. An extreme darkness to an extreme light. Are you following so far?
I think so. I remember the cultists chanting something about that. Just more cryptic.
Yeah, I know. They're bullshit chants and rituals. They spew it whenever they get the chance. If you ask me, I think they just enjoy hearing themselves flap their lips.
He ranted, shaking his head before getting back on track.
What I'm saying is, everything is far more complex than you think. There's several levels of good and bad, and many more entities and creatures that live within those worlds. Everything you see, everything you hear and feel is only how your body interprets it, how your mind is hardwired to understand it. But without those in play, the true reality of the universe you live in is so much more vast than you could possibly imagine.
So, you're talking about a soul? Something that's without a body?
In simple terms, yes. However, you have a human soul. I don't. I come from a place where there's the contrast that I spoke of. Those extreme darks and those brighter lights. You are a lower being. You are food for creatures like us. And in a body of flesh and blood that doesn't change what we feed on. We are the ones who make sure the good souls don't go down into the darkness. We are essentially sentinels that guard what you would call hell.
But what about Satan and God? Do they exist?
Yes and no. Yes, in the sense that there are entities that prefer light over dark and dark over light. But no, in the sense that there's only one. There are hundreds that dwell in those planes, and millions more in between. Bad souls hold the energy that darkness craves. Good souls hold the energy the light craves. Don't you get it? It's all a large cycle. All beings feeding one another in an ecosystem of energy and time.
Okay. Give me a minute to wrap my head around this, I said as I rubbed my temples, trying to put the information together in a way that I could understand it. So, you will be the contrast of light and dark because you ward off the light and sort it out for the others?
Yes.
Okay, so basically you're like death, or a guard dog. You protect both.
In a way, I suppose you could look at it like that.
But that doesn't explain why you're here. Shouldn't you be out there somewhere continuing to do that? You're in a body, and if you're energy, it doesn't make any sense.
You can blame the fucking coaches out there for doing this shit. Having a body isn't special. Anything out there can have one, but it's not ideal. It's an absolute pain in the ass, and you breaking my knee is proof of that. It fucking hurts and flesh is uncomfortable, and I'd much rather go home. But because you fucking humans are always poking your noses into shit because of a power fetish, I'm stuck here.
Okay, but what is here? This is the only word I know. So in the grand scheme of things, what is this place? He grinned at that, showing all of his black teeth that glinted in the firelight.
Creation. The beginning of energy. The Big Bang. Welcome to Limbo, my friend.
He chuckled sadistically. I was struggling to understand all of this, my head hurting to even comprehend it. This was a lot to take in all at once. This threw all concepts of religion and spiritual belief out the window, and here I was sitting in front of a creature who could prove, along with disprove, all of that. I took a couple of deep breaths, needing a moment to just run through all of it before I asked another question. But if they brought you here, then how is that even possible? He went to answer, but before he could, we both turned our heads over to the bars on our cell. We could hear screaming, blood-curdling cries of pain and anguish, followed by yelling and the sounds of several people running in our direction. Decius and I both looked to one another before getting up and quickly moving to the bars, looking down both sides of the long hallway that stretched beyond our cell. It didn't take long for someone to come into view, bolting down the hallway and falling once they reached the torch. It was a young woman, completely bare with long and crude gashes in her sides as she curled up against the wall, drenched in sweat and tears rolling down her face. She held up her hands as she begged on her knees, facing down the hallway as the robed figures came into view, appearing out of the darkness like shadows taking form. "Come now, dear child, there's no reason to be afraid." One of them spoke as they approached, now 7 in number as they surrounded her, her sobs and pleading not doing anything to faze them. Hey, you get away from her!" I screamed, but stopped when Decius put his hand on my shoulder. I looked over at him and was met with a grim expression as he slowly shook his head, telling me no. I looked back at the woman, desperately wanting to help her, but knowing there was nothing that I could do but watch. And the cultists didn't even acknowledge that I was there as they continued. "This is a blessing, a gift. You will become one with the light, more than you ever could imagine." One of them spoke, and I recognized his voice as the leader. Please let me go. Please don't hurt me. No more, please." The woman begged through her sobs, blood dripping down her hips. "You will understand soon enough. His will is strong, and you will be a vessel to his light." The leader spoke again, and I balled up my fist at his words. This woman was in pain, and not one of them were doing anything to step in and help her. I was enraged as I watched on, but held my tongue, knowing I was helpless to help her, and would probably only make things worse if I continued to yell from within the cell. "Please," she cried, but after a moment she began breathing heavily, her panic cries turned into a screaming as she held her head. And her screams began to change in pitch, her body twisting and changing as she sprung to her feet, only to wail in fear before collapsing down to the ground once more, the torch sparking to a ghostly blue from its once flickering red and orange. The cultists began chanting the same chant they used with me, over and over again, as the woman thrashed, as though she were on fire. I covered my mouth and watched on in horror as her screams changed to primal growling. Her eyes bulged out of her head and turned into white, and as her mouth opened, a stream of light erupted from within, flickering and sputtering before her teeth sharpened, and her once soft skin grew pale and rigid before she collapsed. She lay there, only barely breathing as all fell silent, the torch fading back to a normal flame, and the cultists falling silent as well. I could feel the colour drain from my face as I realized what just happened, what they'd done to her, and what they were trying to do to me. They were forcing these creatures into bodies, forcing innocent people to be host to them, and we were both prisoners here, both trapped and both subjects in these people's twisted ideals. I was speechless as they dragged her away. I couldn't do anything but stare at the place where she once was, nothing but a pool of blood remaining from where she was laying on the cold ground. Once they were gone, Decius sighed, patting me on the shoulder. "I changed my mind. Welcome to hell," he said, beginning to move away from me and limp back to his corner of the room. And I was left in shock, horror, and the realization that the situation I was in, the situation we were both in, was far more serious than I previously thought. The Devil's Guard Dog. Part 4. Let's get straight into that. We need to get out of here.
No shit, Sherlock,
Decius grumbled, laying on the floor, still in the same corner, and now curled up around himself as I sat across from him, nibbling on the food I'd been given. If I had to take a guess, I would say that we were there for at least 5 days since I'd arrived. The only reason I came to this conclusion was because I was served food 5 times, and the servants weren't exactly close together. Things hadn't been exciting with him. We made small talk, or playing a game of 20 questions, or a little quid pro quo, so to speak. However, I was learning a lot from him. I told him everything he wanted to know about my girlfriend, and I was shocked to find that he was actually, genuinely interested in what happened. Apparently for his kind, they had no concept of gender or relationships with one another, only living in larger groups and getting their cravings for conversation, or what he calls physical indulgence, that way. And just by being close to others, everything they crave from contact is easily sated. He may not have openly admitted it, but I think I was starting to understand why he didn't just kill me. The dude was lonely. I asked him about the cultists a lot as well, and apparently they call themselves the followers of the dead sun. In a sense, they believe that they can achieve a sort of ascension by bringing these creatures to their world and giving them bodies up as hosts. However, as Decius had said, there can't be light without darkness, and because they were trying to grasp at something so pure, they were not only risking bringing something dark and horrid to our world, but had corrupted themselves in the process. What had started out as something good had now turned into, believe it or die, a forceful oppression they not only forced on people, but on the entities they were trying to bring here. And this was why originally they had took killers and criminals for their rituals, but over time they just stopped caring altogether, and were now no better than the people they brought here, if not worse. Even though we taught a lot, Decius and I had a bit of a problem with one another. It wasn't anything that really had a reason behind it, at least not that I could tell. More a matter of our personalities clashing, and because of that, over the days we were quickly getting on one another's nerves. Now that I wasn't afraid of him, if I'm being completely honest, he was a bit of a dick. You would expect a cryptic being to be refined of a higher intellectual substance. Yes, to a larger extent he was incredibly smart, but on the attitude and disposition side of things, he was just an asshole. I couldn't honestly tell if this was just him normally, or if he didn't like me in particular. Could have been our situation as well, but staying locked up with him for this long was starting to get to me. I'm not a confrontational person, but it doesn't stop me from having my moments, and today was definitely one of those days. Look, buddy, I don't exactly see you coming up with any bright ideas, so if you're not going to help, then knock it off with that attitude.
But he growled and looked over at me. Oh, I am sorry. Am I bothering you? Last I checked, I've been here longer than you, and I'm still fucking stuck. So why don't you shut it?
I rolled my eyes and stood up, grabbing a now empty platter and walking back to set it by the door. There's always a way out. There has to be something around here that you've missed.
Like what, exactly?
I don't know, maybe a broken wall or flaw in their routine.
Oh, that's funny. I can bend metal and rip through flesh, yet I'm the one who missed something that simple. Spare me. I've tried it all. Even managed to kill one of the members of their little boy band. Nothing has worked,
he said, sitting up as his arms shook.
I have tried everything to get out of here, and I hate this place. I hate what they are doing. I want out just as badly as you do, but nothing works.
I just leaned against the door and sighed, rubbing my head from the stress. After a while, I began to pace, hoping a movement would help me think. But I had to be away. Nothing was impossible. But the more I thought about it, the more problems I ran into. We couldn't just run. The tunnels were far too dark to see, and I at least had no idea where I was going, and no doubt Decius did either. B. We were 2 in number, and although Decius was strong, I don't think he could take them all at once. Like he said, he actually killed one of them, and he's still stuck. Not to mention I saw 7 the other night, and there could be more. Fighting and running were out of the question, and so the only real choice was to try and sneak out quietly. But even then, how were we supposed to get out in the first place?
Would you just sit down? Your pacing is going to drive me insane.
He spoke as he curled up on the floor once more, his claws scratching slightly at his back and pulling at the jacket I'd given him. Look, I'm done sitting still and nothing happening. I need to think. I looked over at him and I actually stopped when I saw him. My previous annoyance turned into worry. Hey, you okay? Well, he didn't respond, but I could tell something was wrong. I slowly began to make my way over to him, watching him clearly struggling. Now, we may not have been exactly friends, but I was still concerned for him. And the moment I got about a foot from him, he finally looked up, his pupils the size of pinholes, and his teeth bared. I took a step back. Hey, cool down. I'll give you a space. I was just worried.
You should be,
he seethed, slowly getting to his feet and never blinking as he took a step towards me, his movements calculated and his gaze locked. I could tell that this wasn't a good situation as I continued to back away from him. Decius, listen to me. I know you're not exactly happy with me, but you need to calm down. I spoke, however I was having trouble keeping myself calm at that point. Without warning, he grabbed me by the throat, pinning me back against the wall and pushing the back of my head into a hard surface.
No, you listen, he snarled. It's been days since I fed from you, and I am tired of starving myself for your sake, and being driven insane by your incessant pacing. Let me do this, and I'll heal you right after. But for fuck's sake, just hold still.
What? Are you fucking insane? You are not biting me, you hear? It's not happening. Now, let me go, before I cave in your other knee.
Shut up,
he yelled, taking on a tone I'd never heard before, and sounding as though several people had all screamed the words at once.
Right now, you're the only thing in here that I can feed from. I don't want to hurt your dumbass, but if you want me to help, then I need my head clear. It's either now or an hour from now, and you really don't want to see me get desperate.
I was highly hesitant, reluctant, and overall just not wanting him to fucking bite me again. I knew full well that he was painful and starving, but I really didn't like the idea of some creature I hardly knew anything about biting down into my flesh. However, with that being said, I didn't want him to be in pain either. My sympathetic side and sense of empathy overpowered my fear and reluctance, and I struggled with the idea before responding. Fine, just get it over with.
Hold very still,
he said before pulling the collar of my shirt aside and plunging his teeth into my shoulder, reopening the wound he'd previously left. He may have told me to hold still, but I couldn't exactly help but flinch from the feeling of teeth the size of nails piercing my skin. I half expected him to rip out a chunk, and I bit down hard on my tongue to keep myself from screaming. But, to my relief, he seemed to be just drinking my blood. However, that didn't exactly make me feel better about this. My shoulder twitched and throbbed before he let me go, and my stomach turned when I felt him run his tongue over the mark before he cast me aside. I actually gagged at that and quickly held my shoulder where he'd bitten me, but just like with the gashes, there was nothing there. Even the scabbing from his previous attack was now gone, He casually wiped his mouth, a wash of relief over his face as he gave me a sideways glance.
Stop being a drama queen. You're lucky you didn't encounter me in my world. I would have ripped your soul to shreds, along with my brethren. God, what I would give to taste that energy again. The feeling of a pure soul between my teeth.
He trailed off as he spoke, looking down at his hand with a pensive expression as he gently clicked his claws between one another. What the hell made you go quiet? Are you actually going to be considerate for a change and give my stomach a break? I asked, visibly disturbed by the entire ordeal. Well, he didn't say anything as I calmed down, and I was once more shocked as he grabbed me by the collar and dragged me over to the sink. Hey! Hey! No, you're not doing it again. Just because I let you feed from me once does not give you a free pass, I protested.
Would you just shut up and come here?
He said, blunt and to the point as he looked around as if someone was listening.
You wanted my help, and I have an idea. Are you familiar with astral travel?
Well, I stopped dead in my tracks and raised an eyebrow as I watched him. I knew what it was, or what people said it was, and basically it was the idea that a soul could travel outside of your body for a time before returning. And from what I've heard, you could even visit other planets, or gain control over your dreams. I thought for a long time that it was all just rumors and conjecture, something someone probably made up while on some heavy drugs. However, the fact that he of all people brought it up meant only one thing. You're joking, right?
Have I ever? Look, your soul belongs to your body. I can't get out of here through this because I was forced to be here. I was forced to be in this body, but you weren't. He said as he turned on the sink, a small trickle of water coming from the faucet. You can go out there, look around for an exit, and then come right back.
That's impossible. And even if it wasn't, what makes you think that I could do something like that?
You can't, but I can help you,
he said, clicking his claws against the side of the pewter.
You aren't going to like this, but without any practice or training, the only way to travel outside of your body is to die.
Those words made a heart jump into my throat. However, he continued.
I can heal you as long as your brain remains functioning. I sever the right nerve in your neck, and it's lights out. I'd gladly just break your neck, but it can't heal bone. It'll have to be precise.
And how would you even know how to do that?
I don't,
he said, looking away from me.
Unless you have a better idea, well, this is all we have.
I wanted to refuse. No way in hell I was letting him do this. He didn't know what he was doing, and for all I knew, he was just wanting to kill me and using this as an excuse. I could die right here, right now. Just one wrong move and it's lights out for good. But, with that being said, I didn't know what else to do. I was scrambling for any other options, anything that would get me out of this. But if this worked, we could find a way out of here. And the other alternative of staying and not knowing when the cultists could come back to torture me again seemed more like a hell than dying. Or worse, dying down here as a captive in a cell, forever in this dark place and rotting away. Sometimes life will boil down to one crazy choice. A one and only shot to either win or lose, and this was mine. And so, with a deep breath, fear building in my mind, I looked up at him and asked, what do I have to do?
Just come over to me and face the sink,
Decius said, moving aside for me. I slowly walked over to the sink, placing my hands on the rim and looking down and watching the water swell down into the drain below, down into the blackness. I could feel Decius walk behind me and place his hands on my shoulders. I gripped the sink hard and closed my eyes, my knuckles turning white as I shook. Is it gonna hurt?
Only for a moment,
he said, and I could actually hear the reluctance in his voice as he clasped his hands to the side of my neck, his claws feeling like cold steel as his thumb pressed to the back of my neck.
I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to listen carefully. What you will see on the other side will be a shock. It can be frightening, comforting, or even pleasurable. But whatever you do, do not get lost to it. Remember that you are still alive. You are not meant for that place yet. You need to focus on finding your way back. And I know it can be tempting to stay, or things may conjure up to frighten you away from your body, but you cannot give in to it. You'll have to fight,
he said, taking on a caring tone as he spoke to me. All I could do was nod, and I listened, fighting back tears. I could feel the tip of his claw press against the skin on the back of my neck, just below the hairline at the base of my skull, and I felt like passing out.
I'm going to give you exactly 2 minutes to make it back to your body before I heal you, he began. Any more time and I fear I do permanent damage. And one more thing, you may see my kind on the other side. Do not, and I say it again, do not let them see you. You only know me in this body, but outside of this I am very different, and so are they. If you see them, run, run. Do you understand? Don't talk to them, don't engage with them. You run, and you don't look back.
I gulped, wondering what he meant by he was different outside of his current body, but not wanting to think further on it, nor what his kind fed on. Okay, I understand. Just please, get it over with, I said, my words shaking just as much as my body was. 2 minutes, and I'll be right back here when you wake up. And with that, he pressed his claw quickly into the back of my neck. I felt a sharp sting and an unfathomable amount of pressure in my spine. And although I knew it probably wouldn't do anything, I began praying that he would hit the right set of nerves and wouldn't permanently kill or paralyze me. I could feel the claw go straight into the base of my skull, scraping the bone as it hit deep, only taking a split second. My ears rang, I felt my body involuntarily jump, and within that second, like a light bulb bursting and shattering to the floor, sparks filled my vision. My world went bright like a flash of a spotlight, before flashing to black. Lights out. The Devil's Guard Dog, Part 5. Let's get straight into that. Have you ever experienced phantom pain before? Well, it's a psychological phenomenon where you can still feel a missing limb after it's been taken off. You still feel like you're moving it, and if there were trauma involved, you still experience the pain from it. Some studies have shown that the pain has physical aspects as well. Your nerves straining and your brain not understanding that something is no longer there. Imagine that. Instead of just one limb, imagine it's your entire body. A dull and intangible aching that starts in your chest and then begins to radiate outwardly across your whole body to the tips of your fingers and the bottoms of your feet. Well, the first thing I did when I opened my eyes was instinctively grab the back of my neck and began gasping for air. I fell to my knees and screamed, my mind telling me that I was screaming, but no air came out. And that's just it. My mind was telling me I could feel the pain. I could still feel the cold air and the hard ground beneath me. However, in reality, I couldn't feel anything. This sent me into a brief bout of panic, the contradiction in my mind making me feel emotionally heavy. But even that weight was null. It took me a while to finally calm down, the tightness in my chest beginning to loosen as I looked up. What I was seeing looked normal at first glance. However, the more I focused on my surroundings, the more they controlled it into the passive and fearful imaginings of my own mind. I was reminded of pareidolia, seeing faces everywhere as I struggled to make sense of it all. However, the thing that disturbed me the most was seeing my own body. I understood now why Odysseus had me over the sink. Blood was pouring from the hole in the back of my neck like a pool with a hole in it. My body seized up and jerked as he wrapped one arm under my shoulder to hold me and placed his other hand over the hole to try and slow the bleeding.
Christ, you better fucking come back. Or if you can hear me and you don't, I'll lend myself just to come over there and kick your ass. Just hurry.
Odysseus grumbled, now moving me to lay on the ground as he quickly took off the jacket and used it to apply pressure to the wound. I was calling out to him, but he didn't seem to hear me. I even placed my hand on his shoulder, and he didn't give any hint of a reaction. However, he was right. I needed to move and I needed to be quick. There was no time to ponder over the experience. I had 2 minutes to look around and find a way out, and I'd need time to get back. 1 1,000, 2 1,000, 3 1,000, 4 1,000. I began counting, rounding up and adding 20 seconds to account for my freak-out before bolting. That's something I learned very quickly, where there were rules to being dead. 1, I couldn't fly. Now, this was a bit of a pain as I was on a time crunch, but flight was impossible. However, on that note, I could walk on walls. The only reason I found this out was because in one of the round tunnels, I didn't even notice I was upside down until I came upon a torch that was attached to the wall and burning towards the ground. And 2, I couldn't just move through any wall I wanted. I could move through solid objects, but only if I could see the other side of them. This was another hitch as I couldn't just walk through the steel door. I had to run through the bars and make my way circling back to find the proper path. 25 1,000, 26 1,000. I continued on, running through the darkness and keeping myself to the right, or at least trying to, as this place was extremely disorientating. But hoping that by keeping in the same direction as the door, that I would eventually come up on the other side of it. However, I never did. I felt like I was running forever. I was thankful that I couldn't get winded from all the running. However, I was starting to get worried. This place was a maze from hell. Every turn leading to more forks in the road. Every branching passageway having that many more branching paths that all ran in different directions. The place was a nightmare, and even after turning back, I quickly found myself lost again. I spun in a circle, looking around at the blank and identical walls before falling against one of them and letting my arms fall limp at my sides. You gotta be kidding me, I muttered to myself, not knowing which way to go or where I'd come from. This place was being deceptively large on the inside, and so far entirely empty. And not only that, but I was running out of time. A full minute had already passed and I was stuck. I looked down at my hands, seeing them but also not seeing them. A strange glowing halo of light around my entire body, and yet still entirely see-through. I thought about being like this forever, just a wandering ghost in these halls. I wasn't exactly the more ideal outcome, but at the very least, I wasn't in any pain anymore. And maybe I'd forgotten how to feel emotion altogether, and I'd just be indifferent to it, all in time. It's not like I'd been leaving anything behind. Odysseus maybe, but I couldn't do anything for him with my body anyway. I thought about my mother, an older woman in the beginning stages of dementia, the same conversation we'd have every week about when I would graduate from college. She'd probably forget me too, in time, or not even remember why she was making that phone call to begin with, even a number slipping from her mind. No one was coming for me, and although that may seem like a depressing thought, it was actually a peaceful one. No one would worry. I wasn't leaving anyone in pain if I didn't come home. I didn't have to dwell on the thought of someone waiting for me. I could just pass and that would be the end of it, the end of me. I don't know how long I thought this over, just sitting in silence. However, I could hear something from down one of the halls, and I turned to face that direction when I realized it sounded like something getting closer. Hello? I called faintly, but there was no response. At first I assumed it was probably a couple of cultists, living people who couldn't see me, but as they began to get closer, I came to the conclusion that it was definitely not people. However, something large, heavy, something that breathed large gasps of air, that whistled as it reached its lungs. Something that clicked and growled, something that dragged along the ground, and something, although unseen, conjured up the very image of a beast that could swallow me whole. Fuck, I muttered to myself, quickly looking around before slowly getting to my feet, not making a sound as I made my way out of its path and into a different tunnel. I peeked around the corner, trying to steady myself as I watched down the hall, and right when it came into my field of vision, the torch on the wall sparked blue. When it crawled out of the tunnel like a centipede on the prowl, its body very similar as its mandibles clicked against one another, the entire body of the thing covered in a thick layer of armored scales that sat jet black over its skin. Its skin underneath was silver, giving it a strange iridescence as it crawled over the spot where I once was, sniffing the ground in large huffs of air. Its mandible split to reveal a circular mouth hidden behind, filled with layer upon layer of sharp black teeth. Its body was so long that it wrapped around the top of the tunnel and back down to the ground, a strange shadow-like mist irradiating from it like smouldering coals. And each part of its segmented body sat flattened wings like that of a dragonfly, all barely visible against its black skin, but there all the same. I couldn't describe the amount of sheer and horrible fear I was experiencing. The creature was massive in size and powerful in stature, yet the living embodiment of a walking nightmare. However, the one detail that made every hair on my body stand straight up, as though I were about to be struck by lightning, ghost or not, were its eyes. Well, there were 6 in total, 3 on each side of its head, and all a very familiar, glowing white. I stood completely still as it looked around, crawling on the ceiling and twisting its head to look at the ground below before continuing to crawl along the tunnel. Even if I couldn't breathe, I felt like I was hyperventilating. I was frozen still, just watching each of its hundreds of legs move in synchronization with one another as it went into the darkness. But before I could turn, I was quickly grabbed by my shoulder, and a soft voice came from behind me. "Quickly, follow me." I couldn't believe what I was seeing. It wasn't just only another ghost down here, but it was her, the woman I saw change outside my cell. How? "Shh, it'll be back. We have to go. Come on," she said in a hushed tone as she began dragging me behind her, and I didn't resist. I had several questions, but if this meant getting away from that insect, then I would gladly follow. As she ran with me down a series of tunnels before we came out into what looked like a cell, identical to mine, her and I moved through the bars, and as we did, I saw her sigh in relief. "What were you thinking calling out to that thing? It could have killed you." Whoa. Now hold up. How are you even here?" "I watched you die. Yes, I know," she said, pointing down to a woman in a corner. The woman was identical to her, curled up and sleeping as she looked back at me. "I am dead. Not gone, just dead." "But, are you telling me that your body is now a host?" She cut me off again. "Yes, and my body is home to a duskling now. That other one out there in the tunnels is bad news. I've been hiding from it for a while. They are persistent, but I've managed to keep myself away so far. He prefers to stay around the ritual room, so we should be safe here for a moment, at least." I took a deep breath, taking a moment before nodding. I thought over what she had said. looking down at the woman in the corner as I remembered what happened to her. Are you in any pain? I asked as I looked back up at her. She smiled sweetly at that, brushing her long blonde hair behind her ears. You're sweet to be concerned, but I promise I'm okay. I came to terms with everything that happened a few days ago, and I'm all right. My name is Alice. I'm Fletcher, I said, watching her eyes as I was a little at loss for words. It wasn't just because of everything that happened. It was because she seemed to be content with it all. And if I was completely honest, she was stunning. Early 20s, large dolly eyes, long hair, a soft and kind smile, and a stunning figure. Honestly, if it weren't for the circumstances, I would probably be asking her out right about now. Oh, and thank you for saving me too. I was a little bit lost back there. Don't mention it, she said before glancing back at the bars of the cell. I was taken off guard when she walked up to me and took my hand, but I wasn't exactly complaining either. Come on, you don't have a lot of time, she said, once more beginning to lead me down through the halls as we passed through the bars. Time? Wait! Oh, shit. It's been over 2 minutes. Decius will have already brought me back by now. Hey, don't panic. Oh, it's okay. Time works differently here. But that doesn't mean you have a lot of it, either. If you hurry, you can make it. Wait, how do you know about that? You really think I spent all this time in my cell? No, absolutely not. I've been wandering all over this place. I've been in just about every room, including your cell with your friend. I overheard what you were planning, and when I saw you wandering around, I thought I'd lend a hand. So, you know a way out? Yes, and I'm going to show you, she said, and I felt instant relief when I found out she knew where we were going. And now that I had help, I focused in on it and actually felt hopeful for the first time since I've been here. We twisted and turned down more dark corridors before coming to a pair of large metal doors that were slightly ajar. But as we walked through, I quickly realized where I was. This was the ritual room, the large stone pillars still there. But as I looked around, I came to the realization that it wasn't a room at all. The place was dug down into what looked like a stone tomb. The top completely open to the night sky as a soft and warm breeze blew. No wonder I couldn't see the ceiling before. As I recalled what happened, I remembered seeing the eyes. But now looking up, I realized what I was seeing wasn't eyes at all, but a dark sky filled with thousands of stars, free of light pollution as they sparkled high above us. This is the back entrance to this place. Across the way are the main cells where your friend is. Where we came from is where they house the rest of us. So, how do I get back? Just follow the torches through the tunnels and keep right. If you come from the other way, you keep left and you'll end up back here. There are several main cells down there, but yours is the one at the very end. You can't miss it. This isn't the main entrance. The leader has the keys to that door, so this is the easiest way to get out if you climb the walls to the top. Okay, I just have to find a way out of the cell and we're golden. Oh, holy shit, I can't believe it. Decius' plan actually worked. We're gonna get out of here, I said with genuine excitement in my voice. However, it faded when I looked back at her. She was smiling for me, the dimples in her cheeks showing as she looked up at me, her eyes reflecting the stars. My heart dropped. You can't come with, can you? She shook her head, but to my surprise her smile never faltered. No, but you shouldn't be sad. You're going to get to go home. You should be happy. But you'll be left here, alone. Isn't there something we can do? Or maybe you could follow us and we can find a way to fix you. Find a way to get the Duskling out of you and free the others. Well, that's the thing about the ghost, Fletcher. Eventually, we fade away. Ghosts don't last forever. The memories can, but for us the pain goes away with time, and soon, so do we. You know, the coaches here were right about one thing. After everything that happened, I do understand something now, she said as she moved closer to me, placing her hands on my shoulders. Sometimes just being nice to someone is all we need. The pain dies, but the good parts live on in people around us. My life wasn't good before this. I did a lot of bad things that I regret, but the light will always be stronger than the dark. It's not about how many good or bad things you do in life, it's how much of a simple act means to that person. I know I'm not going to make it, but if you do, then maybe this one good deed will live on. The pain is what we hold on to, but the good is what keeps us moving forward, no matter how small that light is. I was choked up as I looked down at her, listening to her words. She was a stranger to me, but she was kind and with a good heart. Her words warm and gentle. Most importantly, she was right. It reminded me of that contrast Theseus spoke about, those extreme darks to those brighter lights. She understood that simple act of kindness could mean the world to someone, and that someone just happened to be me. All she did was show me the way, and through that it didn't matter what kind of a person she may have been. She saved my life, and that meant moving forward, no longer being stuck in the pain. In other words, I guess sometimes you have to go through a lot of pain to appreciate the little things in life, understanding the dark and shining brightly through it. I wiped my eyes, realizing I was stupid, as I couldn't cry, but the feeling was there all the same. You don't deserve this. Maybe, or maybe not. But it's too late for me now. But no matter where I end up, I'll be okay. Now. She began, reaching up and placing her hand against my cheek. Go. Hurry. It's not your time yet. It's time to go home. I wanted to say more, maybe beg her to come with. I wanted to accept that she was going to be left behind, and I wanted to walk away from her. However, my attention quickly turned to the door where we came in. I whipped my head in that direction as it crashed open, revealing darkness on the other side. The torches that were once behind us had gone out, only leaving a black maw in its wake, and 6 narrowed eyes peered out from it. I went to grab Alice's hand and run. However, when I turned back, she was already gone. The creature from the door lowered its head as it slinked out from the door, its mandibles twitching and its wings vibrating as it locked onto me, the sound rattling in my ears as I backed up. Oh, shit, I said as I stared it down, and it reared its back as it went to lunge, its wings extending and propelling it forward like a shot fired from a gun, mandibles open as it went to grab me. I leaped out of its direction. However, it managed to nick me with one of its clawed legs, the sensation feeling like white-hot fire. I didn't waste any time to turn and run. The creature growled and moving with a speed I'd never seen. And within a second, it was in front of me, going to strike like a demonic cobra as I ducked to avoid it and falling to the ground as I moved under its body and scrambled to the pillar in the center of the room. The agility of this creature far outmatched mine, its body coiling around the pillar and coming over the top. I watched its movements closely, trying to figure out what it was doing next. Its wings vibrated again, and I knew that I wouldn't be able to avoid it this time if it went for me. And so, instead of running away, I ran to the pillar. Its body twisted to bite me, but when I got close to the pillar, it coiled around. The gigantic beast missed from the awkward angle, twisting uncomfortably as it bit down onto one of its own legs. It shrieked as blue smoke erupted from the wound, and I took the opportunity to run to the tunnel on the other side of the room. As I looked back, I saw it crawl down from the pillar, a long and sickly black tongue coming from its tube-shaped mouth, licking over its leg. The smoke began to slowly stop, and it looked back at me, its tongue lapping over its mandibles like a lion licking its lips. "Great job, Fletcher. You pissed it off," I muttered to myself as I continued to run, the creature coming after and hot on my heels as it gave chase, and the hunt was on. The sound of this thing running was like a herd of horses thundering down the path. However, from its massive size, it wasn't able to cut corners as quickly as I was, and crawling on the ceiling and growling in frustration every time it would come inches from getting me before I ducked into a tunnel. I couldn't fly or use its wings in here, another small advantage. However, it twisted over the walls and ceiling, and quickly found that it could get even closer to me by predicting which direction I would take. I had to get back to the cell, and because of that, I had no choice but to keep taking each right turn that came up. And every time the creature would get a little closer, even with its size, it was catching up. I took one more right turn and could see the door at the end of the tunnel. One more home stretch to the finish line. Everything seemed to go in slow motion, me running as quickly as my legs could possibly go, and the thunderous sound of the creature getting ever closer behind me, at least 20 steps accompanying every step of mine. About 30 feet from the door, the creature went to strike, pushing itself forward and falling short, it getting my head, but snagging the back of my ankle as I went flying forward. And I fell hard onto the ground and my body rolled from the momentum, slamming into the door on the other side. I'd made it at the last second. I'd made it. However, I forgot one critical thing. The door was completely solid. I looked up at it, and it was only solid metal in front of me. No way to look through to the other side. No clear path to pass through. And I sank against the door, that hope fading. Complete and utter defeat replaced it as I looked down the corridor, seeing the creature before me. This was it. The creature had won. Game over. Theseus, I muttered as the beast got closer to me. It knew it had won, lowering its head and slowly approaching me, taking its time now that I was trapped. Theseus, I'm sorry. I notice you probably can't hear me, but just know that I tried. I'm so sorry, Theseus. Goodbye, my friend. Thanks for trying to help me, I said to myself, trying to make peace with what little time I had left. I closed my eyes, feeling the hot and stale breath of the creature against my face, waiting for it to bite down and end me. A couple of seconds passed, then a few more, and after a bit I couldn't help but open my eyes. I expected this thing to kill me, eat me like Theseus had said they did, but it was just looking down at me on the ground, watching me, almost studying me. Well, what are you waiting for? Do it, I said as I looked up at it, and I was shocked as it moved away a little. I slowly got to my feet as I watched it, scanning its eyes as it scanned mine, and I was amazed as I could have sworn I saw something in its gaze, something almost human. Wait, could you understand me? I asked. I didn't respond verbally. However, it closed its eyes as it bowed its head. I looked at it and then back to the door, and then back to the creature, and it finally clicked. Dusklings. Theseus was a duskling. He was one of these things. I must have known his name, and it was entirely possible that this creature knew him as well. Theseus said they all lived in large groups. Of course, it would know him. Well, that spark of hope came back as I got to my feet, looking at the creature. I know what these cultists are doing. Theseus told me everything. I'm trying to help. I can get him out of here, and I can stop this, I said as I looked back to the door. Do you think you can help me? Well, the creature just sat there, watching me, its wings flicking a bit before it slowly approached. And I flinched when it opened its mouth and it clasped its mandibles around me. but was being surprisingly gentle with his actions now. It lifted me and moved forward, and before I knew it, I was on the other side of the door. It set me down, and I looked over, seeing Decius sitting next to me as I rolled on my side, him holding his head with a clear expression of stress as the wound on my neck was healing. I had made it just in time, despite all the odds. I looked back at the creature, muttering a quick, "Thank you." As I did, the creature watched me, looking over at Decius and bowing again before disappearing back behind the door. I quickly went over to my body, not exactly knowing how to get back in and a little worried this wouldn't work. But, out of impulse, I just reached down and grabbed my own arm. The moment I made contact, my ear began ringing and my world flashed white. "Come on, kid! Come on! Wake up!" I heard Decius speak, sounding just as stressed as he looked. Coming back into my body wasn't exactly fun. I felt heavy and tired, my ears still ringing, and once I began to wake up, I shot up into a sitting position, gasping for air. I was so cold that I couldn't feel my fingers, shaking violently as Decius came quickly over to me. He sat next to me as I began coughing like a smoker, hacking and choking from how dry my mouth was. And Decius quickly took the jacket I'd given him and wrapped it around my shoulders, rubbing them to help with the blood flow.
"Thank God you're okay. Take it easy. You're gonna feel sick for a couple of minutes."
"No shit," I said, and actually started laughing a little at his words. It wasn't exactly painful, but the best way I could describe the feeling was like walking into a warm house after being out in a snowstorm, my entire body filled with pins and needles as the blood began to flow once again. However, I could have sworn Decius sounded relieved. After all the shit he gave me, he sounded happy that I was back. "Is that excitement I hear? You really did miss me, didn't you?"
"Don't push your luck,"
he snapped, going right back to his typical nature when I called him out. But I had to admit, I was glad to see him too.
"But did it work? Did you find an exit?"
And I looked up at him as the shaking began to subside. I had some help along the way, but yeah, you bet your ass I did, and I know the way. Tomorrow, we are getting the fuck out of here. The Devil's Guard Dog. Part 6. Let's get straight into that. I was covered in my own blood, sprawling on the floor as the cold ground stung my stomach. My eyes were closed and I felt like falling asleep through it all, looking like the remains of a wounded soldier who had lost in combat. The door to the cell unlocked and swung open, the daily meal being carried in by the hooded cultist. However, this time, he was met by an unsettling sight of my own body. "Jesus Christ!" he sighed as he set the platter on the ground. Walking over to me and crouching down, he looked over my body. Seeing the dried blood and assuming the worst as I didn't move. "Looks like that bastard finally got you, huh? Was wondering when he'd get hungry enough to actually do it." He spoke to himself as he went to roll me over, more than likely going to check for a pulse. However, he didn't exactly get very far with that. The moment he touched me, I heard a heavy and wet thwack. It was quickly followed by the blunt and recognizable echo of wood colliding with something hard. The cultist fell onto his stomach beside me, out cold as I rolled over enough to look up at Decius, seeing him brandishing the wooden table leg in his hand and spinning it playfully as he stood over us.
"You know, I think I'm going to enjoy using weapons."
"Fucking took you long enough. I thought you said he'd be coming in any minute. I was falling asleep before he finally decided to show up," I said as I began to get up, dusting myself off. Decius shrugged, letting the wooden leg fall to his side, his hand still loosely clasped around it as he clicked his claws against the shaft.
Either he was late getting here or I misinterpreted what time it actually was. Either way, just search him and take his clothing so we can move. Someone is bound to notice he's gone eventually.
Right, I said, quickly taking off my jacket that was still soaked in my own blood from my now healed neck wound. Threw it to Decius and then began working on undressing the cultist. He was a bit more stalky than myself, and this meant that his robe sat loosely over my shoulders. However, I pulled the drawstrings tied around my waist to hold them on, and then pulled up the hood to cover my eyes. It was strange seeing one of them without the robes, very normal-looking clothing adorning him underneath, and I half expected him to be some deformed or marked-up weirdo. However, he looked completely normal. Probably someone had passed on the street without a second glance. I suppose it was that way with a lot of people, though. You could pass a serial killer and not even notice it in your daily life until you hear about some poor sub getting stabbed on the news. An almost frightening thought to know how little we truly pay attention to the people around us, or just how well the real monsters are able to blend in. I looked through his pockets and grabbed a set of old-looking keys that were attached to a large ring before turning back to Decius as he held out the wooden leg.
Here, you're going to need this. I can handle myself, and so it will be better placed with you,
he said, and I nodded, taking it from him and setting it against my chest under the robes, hooking it under the sash around my waist to hold it in place and keeping it hidden. Now, we both said nothing as we made our way out of the cell and closed the door behind us. I slid the bolt into place and used the keys to lock it, hoping that would buy us a little more time to get out. The plan was to get to the ritual chamber and climb out without a fight. However, we both knew it would be unlikely that we wouldn't run into anyone, and so I figured a disguise wouldn't hurt if someone saw us walking. Hence, the robes. We were both fairly weak, me still recovering from bloodlust, and Decius recovering from any number of things done to him in his time here. And so a fight wasn't exactly a good option. We'd either run, hide, or take the others out without confrontation. This was our only shot at getting out, and as for how to scale the wall to the surface, we figured we'd cross that bridge once we got there. I let Decius take the lead and told him the directions as we went, trailing behind him because, well, let's face it, I'm not the best fighter, and because it was still nearly pitch black down there, and unlike me, Decius could see in the dark, and would be able to spot trouble quicker than I can. We both wanted to run, but resigned ourselves to walking to avoid as much unwanted attention as possible, and keeping our ears open. It was taking some time for us to get there at a walking pace, and silence between us wasn't ever not awkward, even in this instance. But truthfully, how could it not be? I was with a man who wasn't even a man to begin with, not to mention openly admits to enjoying eating humans for survival. He's not exactly approachable, and because of that awkward tension, I broke the silence, keeping my voice low. What do you think you'll do when you get out of here?
Are you seriously asking stupid questions again?
He asked, his tone bordering on snappish, and glancing back at me with a look that basically told me to shut up. However, I wasn't exactly one to listen to that hint. Oh, come on, you've never been mortal before, and never been around humans in their own world. That has to be going through your head right now. What you'll do, how you'll live, what your future will be. He was silent for a moment, thinking it over, and even from the back I could see the gears turning in his head before he let out a brief sigh.
I don't know. Maybe go hide up in your mountains or something. Get away from everyone so I don't get shot.
I'm pretty sure you'd be labelled a Wendigo if someone saw you up there.
Oh, it's not like there's many other options for someone, something like me. I can't have the normal life most of you have.
Maybe not, but there are other options out there. Maybe not normal, but you're not going to be left out on the streets.
Look, don't we have more important things to focus on right now? Enough with the 20 questions bullshit.
Hey, there's no reason to be hostile, especially with someone who's offering you a home.
We don't have time for... what did you say?
He asked, and his demeanor softening as he stopped dead in his tracks, letting me pass in front of him as he fell silent. I turned back to him, placing my hands in the pockets of the robes. You heard me. I'm not just going to let you be a homeless guy. Well, he turned his head to the side slightly, watching with that confused dog look again, and I continued. We may not get along, but you didn't ask for this, and you sure as hell didn't deserve it. Yeah, you're an asshole. Stubborn, hard-headed, and about as gentle as a gorilla in a glass tuxedo. But I don't hate you. You've helped me, so let me return the favor. He just stood there, quiet, blinking a few times before trailing his gaze to the floor.
But I heard you. Why would you want to live with something like me?
Well, I have a cat.
The fuck does that mean?
I have a cat. His name is Felix. He's half outdoor and half indoor. Kinda comes and goes as he pleases. Every once in a while, usually in the early morning, he'll come back with a dead bird in his mouth, trotting around like he's the happiest little bastard on the planet. We have robins around my apartment complex that I particularly enjoy hearing during the summer. And you can probably imagine exactly what kind of bird Felix likes to stuff between his cheeks. And I hate it when he does that. Makes a mess, and like I said, I like those stupid brown and red birds, but never once have I gotten mad at him for it.
What are you driving at here, Fletcher?
What I'm saying is, how can I get mad at something that's in an animal's nature? Yeah, I like the birds and I hate seeing them dead, but I can't be upset with Felix for doing what he does naturally. Just like I can't get mad at a dog chasing a squirrel or a gopher for digging holes in the lawn. Well, it sucks, but how could I possibly be mad at that? And why would I ever judge you for what you do? He was silent once more, and truthfully, I could never hate him. The thought of him feeding from people made my stomach turn, but he couldn't help it. I couldn't force him to starve himself just because I didn't like what was natural for him. Morality over the subject was a moot point, because if I judged him for how he was born, then how would I be any better than him? After a good 30 seconds of silence, he looked up at me, drawing in a deep breath, and releasing it in a steady and almost relieved sigh. He came up to me and placed his hand on my shoulder, endorsing a surprisingly gentle smirk as he looked down at me.
You know, you're a lot wiser than you let on. For a human, at least.
I can't tell if that's a compliment or if you just call me stupid again.
Well, you're still a dumbass. Just less so.
Yeah, well, fuck you too, I said, and for the first time he let out a chuckle that didn't set me on edge. In fact, it sounded calm and genuine. I think we both silently agreed that, even though we were starkly different, we were actually friends. It wasn't long before we were quickly brought back to reality, both of us being pulled away for a moment as footsteps could be heard from behind us, followed by several voices. We both exchanged glances with one another before continuing down deeper into the tunnels, quickening our pace and making our way out. We came upon a large double doors that led to the ritual room, both of us hurrying over and opening them. We tried to be as quiet as possible. However, the old hinges protested to the movement, and creaking and moaning as we opened them, the sound echoed down the halls, an unavoidable alarm that sounded off our exact location. We both shut the doors behind us, shoving a heavy steel bar across the door seam on the other side to hopefully keep the cultists out for a bit. The sky above us was a soft grey, the room covered in an ethereal mist, as shades of a blue and orange sky shone slightly beyond the veil of cool morning dew. Decius quickly ran over to the far wall, brushing his hands over the engraved stone as he looked up to the edge of the chamber.
There's no way we're climbing this. It's too smooth and slick from the air. Even with my claws, there's no footholds, he said, looking back to me.
I glanced around the room, trying to think fast and see if there was anything we could use to climb. My eyes fell upon the pillar in the center of the room, more specifically, the chains hanging from it. Get over here and help me, I called out to Decius as I bolted up to the steps, wrapping one of the chains around my arm and grasping the links tightly in my hands. Decius came up behind me, catching on to what I was doing and grabbing the slack of the chain. Okay, 1, 2, 3! We both jerked the chain back and pulled, hearing the link strain and a loud crack as it went stiff up to the stone. However, it didn't budge. Fuck! One more time. 1, 2, 3! I called out and we both grounded ourselves, putting all of our strength into it as the chain strained once more. This time, the stone cracked and groaned before abruptly popping as the anchor whipped out, sending me flying back as chunks of cement flew at me. Decius caught me by the shoulders, the end of the chain falling to the ground with a loud and metallic clang. We both dragged the chain back over to the wall, looking up. Okay, we need to get this spike up there and see if it'll get caught on anything. Then we climb out, I said, and Decius took the chain from me.
Got it. Just stand back,
he said, taking the chain in both hands and beginning to swing it. I stepped back, watching as it went round and round in circles, picking up speed and momentum before Decius whipped the end of it up and over the side of the wall. And slowly he began to put it back, chunks of dirt and debris falling over the edge as he did. And for a moment I thought this wouldn't work. The debris that followed the chain down was nothing but small stones and loose soil, and I thought there was nothing up there for that to anchor. However, just when I thought the end of the chain was going to drop back down, it hit a snag, and after a couple of pulls, it stayed. Decius even putting all of his weight on it to make sure.
Okay, should be safe. You get up there and I'll follow,
he said as he waved me over. I felt my heart race, the small flicker of hope growing into a raging inferno as it almost was shaking. We were so close. Just one short climb and would be out. I could go home and we could go back to a normal life. No more pain, no more dark cells and cold ground. No more shit food and looming sense of danger. No more fear. Just me, a warm bed, and I began thinking that the first thing I was going to do when I got back was take a 2-hour-long hot shower and buy myself the biggest cheeseburger I could possibly find. I went over and grabbed the chain, giving it a slight tug before I went to climb up. However, I stopped cold when a sound came from behind us. A click. A very familiar, very recognizable click that made my stomach sink, and a lump form in my throat. I couldn't do anything but stare at the stone wall in front of me, the sound washing away all hope that I had. And when Decius reacted the same way I did, I knew it was over. How dare you disrespect this holy ground? Did you really believe we would let you go so easily? The voice spoke, but it sounded far away, down an echoing tunnel. Yet it was the only thing that I could hear, filling my head. I turned back slowly. Even my breathing had stopped at this point, and as I was now face to face with the leader and staring down the barrel of a revolver, his thumb still pressed to the hammer on the back. You are in our home, children, and you do not get to leave until we say so. His voice wasn't like that of a preacher anymore, more like a stern and oppressive father figure that talked down to his children. I went to say something, both Decius and I looking back at him. However, my attempt of talking was drowned out by the loud discharge of the weapon. I closed my eyes and flinched as the gun fired, but no pain came. I could hear Decius's breathing pick up. I looked over at him, at my side. Dread saturated my emotions as I saw him clenching his stomach. and a deep red stain beginning to form under his hands. I could feel the tears well up in my eyes as another shot went off, this one hit in his chest, and he fell back onto the cold ground. And seeing him laying there, the blood beginning to pool, well, that dread was replaced by anger and fear as I looked back to the cultist. I'm not violent, however, seeing Decius shot and bleeding, and knowing all the pain this piece of shit caused, I wanted him dead. He pointed the gun at me, and a smile creeping onto his face as he trained the barrel on my chest, and let off 2 shots, sending me to the ground to lay with my friend. The Devil's Guard Dog. The finale. Let's get straight into that. Corruption of the innocence. As we walk through the dark, corruption of the body brings the gateway to the sun. Death of the mind brings the soul to the door. Opening the door shines the path to the light. I could hear the chanting through the ringing in my ears, slowly fading in as my world around me spun. I could see stars dancing in my vision as I looked up, unable to feel anything through the shock. Was I dead? Dear brothers of the light, we gather here in this, our holy sanctum, to bring forth that which we have spent so long to see. We gather in numbers to bring strength through unity, and power through a collective thought and will. No, I definitely wasn't dead. The fact that I was still here, listening to that fucker's insane ramblings, was proof enough of that. But shouldn't I be? I was slowly coming back to reality as I reached up and felt over my chest. And as soon as I made contact, the pain hit. I'd been shot, but I couldn't feel any blood. At least not the amount of blood that should have been there. And I slowly felt under my robes, and I was shocked when my fingers brushed over the cracked and sharp splinters of wood. My chest throbbed. It was hard to breathe, and I could feel my sternum crack as I tried to draw in a deeper breath of air. However, the bullets never touched my skin. The table leg was in splinters against my chest, the robes ripped. However, it had saved me, the impact of the shots tearing through the wood. Blessed is the light, hallowed is the dark. I heard a group of people chant as their leader continued. However, I wasn't paying much attention to him to hear more of his words. I looked over and saw Decius still laying there, and felt relief and worry as I saw that he wasn't dead. He'd rolled on his side and curled up and clutching his chest and stomach, panting as though he'd run a marathon. But he was actually alive. Decius, can you hear me? I called faintly to him, and he slowly opened his eyes to look at me, his gaze reflecting nothing but pain and anguish. Please hold on. And the state he was in wasn't anywhere near good. I couldn't even begin to guess what the bullets may have hit inside of him. His hands were shaking, his eyes looked cold and dim, and his lips were already blue as blood seeped through his fingers and into his clothes. You're alive? He said, struggling through the words as he watched me, and I gave him a faint smile, trying to let him know that I was okay. And I think we both knew neither of us were okay. On this day, as the sun rises, we will be free from this mortal grasp, free from the constraints of the mortal plane. Hallowed are we as we open the door. The leader's disciples chanted back, and I looked over to watch them. The leader was standing on top of the steps that led to the pillar, his arms outstretched around 20 people who stood below him, looking up to him as though he were a god among men. The 2 others stood with their arms folded in their robes at the base of the stairs, facing out to the crowd and guarding their leader. 3 more sat chained on their knees between them, dressed in what now remained once more normal clothing, ripped and stained from an undesirable amount of wear. I recognized them, sitting in the middle, her matted hair hanging over her face. It was Alice, or at least her body, that is. And the leader slowly looked over to the side at me, his eyes sunken in and fixed with the gaze of a madman, and his lips curled into a wrinkled smile. "Well, looks like you're awake, dear one. Rejoice, you'll be the first non-believer to bear witness to his glory," he said in a tone that oozed with ill intent and controlled hate. He looked down to the two men at the base of the stairs as they looked back to him, nodding them in our direction as they began coming over without hesitation. I wanted to get away from them as they came to us. However, any movement made my chest heave with pain, and before long they were there, one of them lifting me up by my shoulders as the other grabbed Decius. "Get your fucking hands off him!" I screamed through my pain, my voice cracking as they ignored me and dragged us up to their leader. They threw us down at his feet without any regard of our injuries, me falling painfully to my hands and knees as Decius fell on his back, clenching his teeth. And the leader crouched down, pulling back his hood over his bald head as his eyes fixed on mine. "You'll see soon enough. Once the door is opened, he will enlighten you with his words of wisdom and knowledge. No one is entirely lost after all." And without hesitation, I spat in his face, staring him down and not wanting to listen to anything more this nutjob had to say. He, with a frightening sense of calmness, reached up and wiped away the spit from his eye, smiling at me once again. "All in due time. I know you'll soon understand," he whispered, looking me dead in the eye before getting back to his feet and pointing behind us as he looked to his men. They both ran past us before coming back around. I looked to see them carrying Alice over to the pillar as their leader followed. Decius was now watching them, as well as the leader grabbed Alice by the throat and pushed her back against the stone, withdrawing a dagger from his side and pressing the blade to her throat. Decius growled and hissed, reaching a bloody hand out and clawing at the stone, a futile attempt to pull himself closer and stop them. "This is a necessary evil. This is the key to the door," the leader said, and I had to quickly look away as he abruptly slashed her neck. The last thing I saw was her white eyes glowing under her hair, as Decius let out a scream that shook me, and I couldn't bring myself to watch. I heard her body fall to the floor. I looked up to see her lying there, empty, lifeless and still, and her blood began to run down the steps. Behind her, the pillar began to vibrate, a large crack shooting up the middle just as the sun crested over the edges of the chamber and casted a ray of light between the stone that was now separating. The leader looked back at us, grinning as his people chanted in unison, his eyes growing white along with the two guards. And as he closed them, the pillar suddenly split with a loud crash, followed by silence. The sun, that was once of bright gold, was now casting rays of red and black darkness beyond the gateway, like looking into a black hole that led to nothing but a cold dark. The ground around where the pillar had split was now an open moor, and as I looked down, I could see movement within. Hundreds upon thousands of small legs scuttled around in the pit, a mass of hellish bugs that gnashed their pincers like hungry piranhas. My stomach turned as they reminded me of hellgrimmets, and if you've never seen a hellgrimmet before, be glad you haven't. Their leader opened his eyes, and that twisted grin still present on his face as he looked out at his people. "You see, my brothers, this is our utopia. This is our redemption, forgiveness, and salvation," he called out, and as I looked back at everyone, I could clearly see that most, if not all, were afraid.
However, the leader didn't skip a beat. "This is the gateway through the dark. This is the path. We have opened the door. We have used the key. And this is our light," he cried out to them, sounding hysterical. He turned back to me, reaching down and tilting my chin up to look at him. "Now do you see?" He began in a soft voice, his white eyes looking straight through me. "I have been trying for years to get through to the other side, and when I did, I found that there is so much more than I could ever have hoped for. The Dusklings were a means to an end, so few of us ever survived their possession. But now we may make all who follow the light as powerful as those that walk through the dark. All will know his grace, and all will know the true meaning of life after death." I balled up my fist against the stone below me, anger filling me as I fought hard not to deck him. "So this is what you wanted all along? You were using the Dustlings to what? Make yourself some kind of fucked up hybrid? No, my child. They know no concept of pain. They're not suffering, but humanity. We have suffered for far too long. They can help us by giving us the power to cure all, help those in need, and end any and all conflict. You ripped them from their home, stuffed them into bodies and forced them to take part in your sick ideals. Seems to me the only lesson you teach is pain, because from what I've seen, they understand it pretty fucking well. Now that you come into the mix, you fucking psychopath piece of shit." He whipped his hand away from me and backhanded me hard across the face, nearly hitting me to the ground before grabbing my collar and pulling me back up to meet him. "You know nothing of pain. This is the only way. This is as above, so below. This is the only way to ensure that peace is achieved. There can be no light without darkness." "So your solution is to torture a race you had no business interfering with in the first place?" I asked, and although in pain, I held my ground, burning with hatred. "This isn't peace. This is slavery and torment. I don't care about your means to an end. You're just a madman who gave up his humanity for power at the expense of someone else." I yelled, and he went to hit me again, this time with his fist balled. However, he hesitated, and Odysseus, out of nowhere, began chuckling to himself. And the leader paused, looking over at him with anger and now growing confusion. "What on earth are you laughing at?" he hissed, his normal holier-than-thou attitude obviously replaced by anger at this point. However, I was also a little taken back by Odysseus. He continued to chuckle as he rolled onto his back, coughing up spats of blood as he looked up at the sky. "So, this was your plan? Open a fucking portal to our world? You idiot." He chuckled to himself. "What did you say?" The leader seethed, letting me go and beginning to move over to Odysseus, obviously offended by the comment. "You heard me. All this shit about gaining power from us and using it to make yourselves more powerful for the betterment of humanity. You're stupid, because you forgot one very, very important thing." "And what would that be?" the leader asked, anger dancing on his words as he stood over him, slowly withdrawing his dagger once more. Odysseus looked up at him, a smile on his face as he said, "What we're made to protect." When the room suddenly grew cold, a cold that burned down into my core and shook me to the bone as the chamber began to grow dark. I could see my breath as everyone looked around in confusion, a heavy black mist beginning to seep out from the gateway. Echoing footsteps came from seemingly everywhere, and as I looked up through the gateway, I could see someone walking closer from the other side. Even the leader was now looking back through the portal at the person bathed in darkness, his steps slow and methodical, appearing to take all the time he pleased and with no urgency
of the situation. "What is this?" the leader asked, the blade still in his hand as he took a wary step back away from the portal he had opened. The figure was at least 7 feet tall as he stood at the edge of the rift, the chamber now completely dark, save for the eclipsing light of the dead sun beyond. He stopped, looking from left to right and then back forward through the gate. He slowly reached up, beginning to pull down his hood and take a step through. The moment he entered, all of the people behind us grasped their heads, screaming and crying out in anguish, some of them falling to the ground, some walking in random, blind directions, and some running for the door as it slammed shut before they could even get close. The moment the figure was all the way through, the room felt deathly quiet, all of the followers falling to the ground and laying still. The figure pulled back a veil from his face, and I was surprised to be looking up at a seemingly ordinary man. He was charming. Short slicked hair, chiseled face, dark yet regal. However, this illusion didn't last very long. He took a deep and slow inhale, and as he let the breath out, a stream of smoke followed through hundreds of teeth that pierced through his lips. Some slipping between one another as his mouth opened, going up past his nose, down below his jaw, and all stretching back to his ears like woven hypodermic needles. And he was calm, seemed to take a degree of pleasure from the air he breathed, and the cold leader, a man who once commanded subservience, was now shaken in his presence as he got down and bowed before him. "It's you, Master. It's really you?" The cult leader spoke, his words filled with awe and now growing fear as his 2 men bowed with him. The figure opened his eyes and looked down at him, a snake-like tongue flicking out as his eyes took on a shade of red I'd never seen before. The figure bent down to him, his face going back to a resemblance of human as he reached out a red-clawed hand and tilted the leader's chin up.
"You are no servant of mine. Your heart is blackened."
The figure spoke simply, his words filled with whispers of any number of voices that followed his own. "But I don't understand." The leader quivered, only to be met with a smile from the figure.
"Shh. Your words are wasted on my ears. Your soul tells me all I need to know."
It spoke simply, and didn't give the leader a chance to respond before grabbing him tightly by the throat. The other 2 quickly got to their feet, going to rush in and help their leader. The figure looked back at them, 2 sets of dark wings extending from his back, and the sharp-tipped tail uncurling from underneath his cloak. One of the cultists was impaled by this thing's tail, and the other was thrown back by its wings, flying a few feet and slamming into the side of the gate before falling down into the pit. I could hear his screams from below as I tried to drown them out. The figure flicked the other cultist off his tail before wrapping it tightly around the leader's chest, lifting him into the air and never letting go of his throat.
"This is your doing, and this shall be your fate."
It spoke, and within an instant its tail contracted and his grip tightened. I cringed and turned away as I heard a series of cracks and crunches, my stomach lurching into my throat as the leader was dropped to the floor like a discarded and broken ragdoll. I could tell, just from the sound, that he wasn't ever getting back up. I could hear the figure walk by me before stopping. I looked up at him. I could feel tears threatening to spill down the corners of my eyes as I looked into his, my mouth quivering. Please don't hurt me." I spoke, barely able to get the words out as I shook with fear. And he crouched down to my level and reached out to me. I flinched at his touch as he brought his hand to the side of my face, and the tears began running down my cheeks.
"Have you sinned?"
No, I I stammered, at a loss for words.
Tell me, have you committed wrong? Is your heart heavy?
I don't know. I'm trying. I don't want to hurt anyone. I'm not the best person, but I'm trying. I quivered, on the verge of completely breaking down. The figure didn't say anything as he brushed away my tears, and I felt like I was going to pass out from the fear alone.
Then you need not fear me.
He spoke, and his words caught me off guard as I looked up at him. In spite of his appearance and what I'd seen, there was a soft expression as he began to stand and walk back to the gate, and stepping over the gap as though it wasn't even there. Beyond the portal, I could see several more of the figures waiting for him, all watching with various dusklings at their sides. He stepped through, looking back at me as the chamber began to grow bright and the sides of the portal began to crumble to dust, falling to the ground in chunks and filling the gap. And before long, it was completely gone. I sat there, trying to come to terms with what just happened, and I wiped my eyes. The warm sun hit my face and lit up the place, the fog beginning to clear as birds began singing from somewhere beyond. I was in shock, completely lost to the mix of emotion that I felt, and only snapped out of it when I heard Theseus coughing again. I quickly went to his side. His lips were completely blue now. His breathing laboured as I began to get him up. I took off the robe I'd been wearing once we got to the wall, tossing the shattered table leg on the ground and tying the fabric tightly around Theseus' stomach, strapping the sleeves up and over his chest to try and stop the bleeding as best I could.
Just leave me,
he groaned, struggling to stand on his own as I grabbed the chain that was thankfully still hooked to the top of the chamber wall.
I'm not worth it.
Bullshit. Stop talking like that. I'm going to get you out of here, I said, beginning to climb. I was in so much pain that the climb alone was nearly enough to make me pass out, my arms straining as my chest throbbed. However, I somehow managed to pull myself up and over the side of the wall. I looked out at my surroundings, seeing nothing but a sparse forest landscape ahead of us. I didn't know where we would go or how we were going to make it, but for now I had to focus on getting Theseus out. I turned and looked back down into the open chamber, seeing him still hunched against the wall. Come on, grab onto the chain and I'll pull you up.
You really think you have the strength for that?
No, but I'm not leaving your ass down there. Now grab on. I called down, gripping the chain tightly in my hands and dislodging it from a tree root it had been caught on. Theseus was reluctant but grabbed the chain and wrapped it around himself. I pulled and strained, Theseus helping to lift himself where he could but not able to do much to help me. I was seeing stars again by the time I pulled him to the edge, my hand slipping several times. However, I wasn't going to give up. My chest was so tight that I thought it was going to cave in. My arms gave out the moment Theseus grabbed hold and began to pull himself up. I fell backwards as I breathed in heavily, and beads of sweat dripping down my forehead. Theseus fell beside me after he had crawled out of the hole, both of us in pain. I looked over at him to see his eyes closed and quickly reached over to shake him. Hey, no, not happening. You stay awake, you hear me?
What does it matter? I'm not gonna make it. Fletcher, we both know that.
I struggled back to my feet and leaned down to grab his arm, putting it over my shoulder, giving everything I had to lift him. I'm not letting you give up. Not now, not fucking ever. Now get your feet under yourself and walk. He seemed surprised that I was ordering him. However, I meant it. We were so close, and after everything we'd been through, I wasn't going to let him give up. I wasn't going to leave him to bleed out and die. Now we walked for what felt like hours, leaves crunching under our feet, and we used trees in our paths to push ourselves forward, almost falling on each other for support in our path. My legs and lungs were burning, and with each step I could feel Theseus getting colder.
May I ask something of you.
Well, if it involves leaving you, then no, I said, glancing down at him.
Just promise me that when we get out of this, that you'll go to her.
What are you talking about?
You know who I mean, and you still care about her. Just promise me you'll find a way to be at peace with what happened. I'm only asking that you find closure after all this time.
He was coughing through his words, a stream of blood beginning to run from the side of his mouth before he wiped it away. I knew who he was talking about. I'd been holding on to Aurora for years, wondering what happened, what went wrong, and no matter how much anger I felt for her, I knew that Odysseus was right. I still loved her. I nodded, reluctantly agreeing with him. I'll try, I promise. I looked up and stopped for a moment as a sound came from somewhere off in the distance. It was a deep rumble, echoing off the sides of the canyon, and my heart raced as I realized it was the sound of a car engine. I pushed Odysseus to move faster, and we quickly made our way closer to the noise as the noise came closer to us. However, Odysseus couldn't keep up the pace, falling from my grasp and collapsing to the leaves. Fuck! Come on! Get up!
I can't.
Yes, you can! Now, come on! I said, trying to lift him, but I knew I couldn't. I didn't have the strength to carry him with me. He pushed me back, looking up at me as he curled up onto the ground.
Just go. Catch up to the car.
No, I'm not.
If you can find help, then you can come back for me. But right now, you need to move. Now go. Hurry, before they pass us. I'll be okay.
He interrupted, and as I looked down at him, I knew the decision was made. I'll come back for you. You hear me? Don't give up on me.
I don't plan on it. Now go.
He said, and I began backing away from him. I didn't want to leave him. He looked like death, and I didn't know how I would forgive myself if he passed while I was gone. However, I had no choice. I turned, and in spite of my pain, I pushed myself to run, stumbling through trees and off in the direction of the car engine. I could hear the tires scrape over the dirt as I got closer, and adrenaline pumping through my body as I came up a dirt road, plumes of smoke filling my lungs as a large truck raced past me. Hey, over here! I screamed, choking on the dust as the taillights began to grow smaller in the distance. Over here! Help! Help! Help us! Stop! I continued to scream, falling to my knees in the center of the road. And as I watched, I saw the lights grow brighter as the truck stopped and then began to back up. I coughed and sputtered, waving my arms over my head to get their attention. And two men dressed in hunting attire jumped out from the vehicle as it came to a stop and quickly come to my side. They asked what happened as I collapsed against one of them, no longer able to hold my body up. I felt a wash of relief, and I told them about Odysseus. Please, my friend is back there a ways, and he's badly hurt. Please help him. I pleaded with them, and one of the men took off in the direction I pointed as the other pulled me up. He walked over to his truck, leaning me against it as he opened the back door and helped me into the cab. Please don't let him die. Please. I continued to beg as he brought out a small medical kit from under the seat, beginning to quickly get out a pill bottle and bandages. Just take it easy. You're safe now. We'll get you and your buddy to a hospital, he said, his voice rough as he began to treat my chest as best he could with what simple supplies he had on hand. And I was fading out, whether it was from stress, the pain, or exhaustion. Who knew? When his partner came back, I could hear them talking to one another as I laid in a cab, trying to stay awake, but quickly failing. They talked in hushed tones. What they said made my heart sink. Odysseus was gone. He hadn't died, hadn't bled out somewhere alone in a forest. He was just gone. Apparently the hunter had found where he'd been laying, seeing the blood that was spread around the ground litter, but there was no sign of Odysseus anywhere to be found. I wanted to scream at them as they got into the truck, beg them to stay and to keep looking, but my eyes were so heavy that I couldn't even bring myself to open them as they began driving away. Away from the cult, away from the death and the destruction they'd caused, leaving behind the twisting halls and dark chambers, leaving behind Odysseus. I spent 3 months in hospital. The beeps and gasps of the medical machinery were the only things to keep me company most nights. The shots from the gun left me with a fractured sternum, my chest covered in patches of deep purple and green bruising. I was dehydrated, malnourished, and my mental state was anything but stable. And the police got involved shortly after I arrived, and taking a hunter's stories along with mine, I told them everything in every detail, and of course they didn't believe me. However, they did go back and look for Odysseus and the cult, and unsurprisingly they found the chamber, and a massive investigation was launched into the cult's activity. I was mentally evaluated, and after they determined I wasn't nuts from my time spent there, they had no explanation for what happened to me. The investigation uncovered a lot about the cult of the dead sun. Turns out they'd been around for years, slowly building in numbers. They linked 27 missing person cases to them, finding various branches of the cult scattered throughout the United States and parts of Central Europe. However, throughout the investigation, they uncovered something much, much darker. The main branch of the cult was not only kidnapping adults, but a total of 58 children were discovered within that temple. Some were adoptions that had gone under the radar through various methods. However, most were born into the cult, or children of the families involved. It was twisted. The conditions these children were found in were nothing short of deplorable. After the arrest of their leader, the cult was brought down and slowly faded into myth. All was covered up by officials who didn't want to admit the extent of the tragedy. And as for me, I spent the next year in deep depression. Something about coming back to a quiet and empty apartment after everything that happened seemed so out of place. I felt like I didn't have a place anymore, and no matter how hard I pushed the police to search for my friend, they always came back empty-handed. Odysseus was gone, and I was left alone. I spent a lot of nights drinking, trying to drown myself at the bottom of the bottle so I didn't have to face reality. The cult was gone, but I didn't feel any better about it. All I could feel was a heavy guilt, and it was a feeling I washed away night after night, sometimes sleeping on the streets because I was too drunk to make it home. On one particularly lonely night, I was dwelling over what happened a year prior, just thinking over it all and thinking of what I could have done differently to save him. And I remembered his words, making me promise to go back to Aurora, find her, and talk about what happened. And so, in a last-ditch effort to get myself out of bed, I kept my promise. It didn't take me long to find her, and I half expected a fight when we met up. We were both reluctant, but when I saw her, she was just as beautiful as the day I'd met her. It was awkward to say the least. We'd gone to a restaurant, talked about what happened over the time we'd been apart, and I was skating around the subject of a cult. She always knew when I was hiding something, and our time apart and what happened between us didn't change that. She pushed, and after a year of hiding, I finally let it all out of my system. Everything I'd held back came flooding out in streams of tears as she held me, and I didn't stop crying until it was time to leave. We never got back together. I know, it's disappointing, but truth be told, we weren't right for one another. I loved her, and always would, but we just didn't work. She was one to run and be free, and I was one to lean more towards stability and order. One was constantly pulling on the other in either direction, and in a relationship that would only pull us apart again. It's been 5 years since that day, 6 since I was taken by the cult, and in that time I've cleaned myself up. I'm still broken. However, Aurora is still there for me. Even as friends, we get along fine after that night. I found that closure. Not perfect, but knowing that I have people to turn to, well, it helps. I ended up going back to college. However, I changed subjects. Ended up studying psychology and demonology. And I'm actually going to graduate within a week with my first degree. I'm actually excited. I grieved for Odysseus for a very long time. that feeling of failure is something that follows you everywhere. However, like Alice had said, ghosts fade away, and as they die, so does the pain. I thought I could forget about him, but obviously that wasn't going to happen. I found a friend in the most unlikely of places, in the most unlikely of circumstances. I could never forget my time down in those tunnels. And after last night, I found reason to hope again. It was midnight. I was sitting at my desk, drinking coffee and going over some paperwork I had yet to finish. My apartment was quiet and my cat sitting in my lap as I pushed my glasses back onto my nose, when suddenly the phone rang. The hell? I asked myself, looking at the clock and seeing how late it was. I sighed, getting myself up as Felix jumped down. I walked over to the phone and picked it up. Hello? Who is this? I asked, and there was a long pause, soft breathing coming from the other side of the line. Hey, listen, I can't hear you, so either explain why you're calling at nearly 1 in the morning, or I'm hanging up.
Is this Fletcher speaking?
Yes, this is he. Who's this?
You sound different.
What? What? Look, buddy, I'm gonna hang up now. Go prank call someone else.
And yet the attitude hasn't changed one bit.
The man on the other side of the line spoke, and I withdrew the phone from my ear to look down at it. There was something about that voice, something strangely familiar. I just looked down at the phone for a good minute before holding it back up to my ear. Answer my question. Who are you? Well, there was a chuckle from the other side of the line, and it was something that sent a very familiar chill down my spine, in probably the worst and the best way possible.
You wouldn't believe me if I told you, human.
Wow. Wow. Certainly another one. Wow. I don't know about you guys, but that one absolutely hit all marks for me. And I got an inkling that you guys sank your teeth into that one with no problem. Of course, a huge thank you to the incredible author, Silver-Syndicate, over on Reddit No Sleep. Absolutely incredible work and such captivating and lovable characters. A big thank you for allowing me to narrate it on the show, and of course, I really look forward to more of your work in the future. Well, guys and girls as ever, you know the drill. Please do let me know what you thought down below in the comments box. Please do like and share. It really does help build the channel and our community further. Why not hashtag TeamFEAR and DMT's Cryptid Crew. Now, of course, if you have a story or would just like to have a crack at things like myself, then please do get in touch with me at the contact email, which is as on screen. contactthedeadone@gmail.com. I really look forward to hearing from you. Well, another one bites the dust in one recording and in one video. I hope you guys are enjoying these longer videos. Of course, please don't forget to smash that like button. Hit the subscribe if you haven't subscribed already to the channel. Lots and lots in the pipeline that's guaranteed to take you on an adventure and put chills up your spine. As ever, guys, I hope you're all well and happy, fighting fit and staying focused. But above all, remember, be safe, not sorry.